Hi, my name is Lynn and today I will be showing you how to sew the Marlon dress, which is a sleeveless dress and the bodice is fully lined on the inside, which makes it super comfortable. It's finished with an invisible zipper and it has these side ties, so you can tie them in the back or in the front. This is the mini version, but it also comes in a midi version, which is included in the sewing pattern. The PDF pattern also comes with detailed, illustrated sewing instructions in addition to this video tutorial. I am using this cotton gingham fabric, and for the lining I will also be using a white cotton fabric that I'm repurposing from some old bed sheets. You will also need one invisible zipper, 60 centimeters long. I picked one in a matching color with my main fabric, which will help make the zipper even more invisible. Lastly, you will also need some sewing thread. I'm using this white thread for any seams that are on the inside, and then I'm using this pink thread, which matches my fabric for any seams that will be visible on the outside. You will need the printed pattern. You can get the PDF pattern on my website. I will link it down below, or you can also get it on my Etsy shop. The pattern contains instructions on how to measure out the skirt pieces directly onto your fabric, which will help save paper. So here are all of the pattern pieces cut out. I have 2 back skirt pieces, which look like this. One big piece for the front of the skirt. Then we have 2 pieces for the back of the bodice. So these are 2 different pieces that you will cut mirrored. So they will look like this. And we also need a lining for the bodice. So you cut 2 pieces of lining as well. Then we have one big piece for the front of the bodice, which looks like this. And I also traced the dart lines on the wrong side of the fabric. And then you will also need a lining piece for the front of the bodice, which also has the dart. Then we have 2 pocket pieces, which are also just rectangles, our invisible zipper. And then finally you will also have 2 big pieces for the side straps of the dress. I'm making the mini version of the dress, so my skirt pieces are quite short. If you want to sew the midi version, or if you want to make it even longer and make like a maxi length skirt, then these pieces will be a lot longer. One quick note about seam allowance. So the seam allowance is included in the pattern pieces and is always 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch unless otherwise noted. There are a few exceptions where the seam allowance is 0.5 centimeters or 2/8 of an inch, 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch, or 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch. In these cases, I will always explicitly state the seam allowance both in the video and in the written instructions. I'm very sorry, I got a bit confused with the conversions at the beginning of filming this video, so I do mess up a few times with stating the seam allowance. I will always put the correct seam allowance on the screen, so make sure to check that. The seam allowance can also be found in the instruction booklet that comes with the pattern. I'm going to show you a little trick to trace the dart lines onto the fabric. So I'm going to lay out my pattern piece on top of the fabric, and this is the point of the dart. I'm going to take a needle and poke it through the dart point, and you're going to make a little hole, and then you're going to take your erasable fabric marker and trace on top of the hole so it will go through to the fabric. And you're going to mark the end of both of the legs of the dart. So this one ends in the corner and this one ends over here, and you just want to connect up all of the points like this. And then I will also trace the dart line, which is the middle of the dart, going from the point of the dart until this highest point. And then you have your dart marked, and you can just repeat it on the other side. Make sure to trace it on the wrong side of the fabric. So we're gonna start by ironing the side straps in half so it's easier to sew. I have both my straps with the right side facing up, and I'm gonna fold them in half and iron along this crease and repeat for the second strap. So I now have both my straps ironed right sides together, and now we want to sew across this slanted edge over here. So you start here, sew up until here, and then you're gonna sew all the way down until you reach the bottom of the strap, and this part we're going to leave open. Do this for both of the straps. I have both of my side straps completely sewn along this edge and the long edge, and then we have a small opening over here. You're going to cut these edges like this. You may also want to trim this top edge a little bit, although I don't think it's strictly necessary. And then you're going to turn the strap right sides out. And then we're gonna press the straps. So we will now iron the dart line on the front bodice. This is the wrong side of the fabric and I have my dart. So I'm gonna take this piece, fold it along the dart line and iron this in place like this. So you wanna fold along the middle of the line and then iron that in place. And repeat for the other side and for the lining. Okay, so we have all of the darts pressed with the iron and now you want to sew them. So how we will do this is, we'll show you, you fold in half along the dart line, which is where we just pressed, and you're going to sew along this dart leg, and you're going to start at the armhole back stitch, go all the way here, and as you approach this dart point, we want to sew up until the dart point over here. You're gonna slowly decrease your stitch length and try to get as close as possible to the edge over here. And when you reach this point, don't backstitch, leave 2 long pieces of thread and tie a double knot. I have sewn along the dart leg. I have 2 long tails over here, and I've kind of like approached this dart point as close as possible, and then you want to tie a double knot with these 2 threads. Okay, so I have all of my darts sewn in place. This is the main front bodice and this is the lining, and now I'm going to press the darts. You want to press the lining and the main front bodice dart in the opposite direction so it will make for a less bulky armhole later on. I'm going to press this one upwards, and for the lining I'm going to press the dart downwards. I want to cut off any excess fabric that you might still have from the dart poking out of the armhole, just to smooth out this edge. There we go. And you have a smooth curve. Next, I'm going to take all of my lining pieces and I'm going to fold the bottom edge of the bodice lining upwards by 1.5 centimeters, 5/8 of an inch. And you want to do this with the wrong sides up. So this is the front bodice, you have the dart, and I'm going to press. So you're going to do this for the front bodice and also for the 2 back bodice pieces. And you want to keep this edge folded upwards for the entirety of the pattern. So going forward, these edges, all of these edges, will remain folded upwards for the rest of the instructions. Next, I'm going to attach the side ties to the front bodice. Just a quick heads up here. So I'm going to attach the side straps now in the video, but actually you can wait a bit and attach them at a later point, which might be easier because they won't be getting in the way when you're sewing the rest of the bodice. My pattern testers pointed out to me that this was easier. So basically you can attach them after you've closed the armholes, but before you close the side seams. If you have a look at the instruction booklet that the pattern comes with, there I did fix the sequence, so go and have a look there. For the video I'm going to keep it as is because I think visually it will get confusing otherwise, but just so you know, you can postpone attaching the side straps until later. And I've marked these notches on the front bodice pattern piece over here onto my fabric. So I've marked them over here, and I'm going to take one of the side ties and align it with those two notches. I like to have the edge that has the seam pointing downwards, but it doesn't really matter. So I'm just going to align this and pin it in place. And then you wanna sew this along this edge with a seam allowance of 1.5 centimeters or 2/8 of an inch. Again, you're going to repeat this for both sides. We are now going to cut a small part of the armhole of the lining, so the front lining and the back lining. And this is marked on the pattern piece, so you can see there's a second line marked on the pattern piece, which is 1.5 centimeters or 2/8 of an inch removed at the armhole all the way down. And then it sort of blends into this side seam over here. You can trace it from the pattern, or what I like to do is just measure it directly onto this fabric piece. So you want to see that it's about 0.5 centimeter or 2/8 of an inch at the shoulder seam, and then it's going to blend in to the side seam over here. And this might be a bit easier because of the dart. So if you trace it after you finish the dart. So I'm going to trace this before I cut off this part of the armhole. And you're going to repeat this for all of the lining pieces. So also for the back to bodice pieces, you're going to cut off part of the armhole. Next, we're going to start putting the lining and the main fabric together. So I have my main front bodice piece lying down with the right sides facing up. You have these side straps attached, which can be a bit fiddly. You want to keep them out of the way, so don't sew on top of them. And then I'm going to take the lining piece for the front bodice and I'm going to put it right sides facing the right side of the other piece, and the right sides are facing each other. And then I'm going to pin along the neck hole seam. So you're going to pin this in place, and then we are going to sew along the neckline using a seam allowance of 1 centimeter or 5/8 of an inch. I'm going to do the same thing with the two back pieces of the bodice. Put the lining on top of them with right sides facing each other. This time we want to keep this edge open because we're going to install a zipper later on. So I'm going to pin along this neckline again, but I'm going to end at about 5 centimeters from this back center edge. So that's 5 centimeters or 2 inches from this center line, and you want to sew up until that point. This point we're gonna leave open for this part, so we can put in the zipper later and come back and finish this seam later on. So also here you're going to use a seam allowance of 1 centimeter or 5/8 of an inch until you reach this point, and this part we leave open. Okay, so I've sewn along the neckline, and now I'm going to make some snips in the seam allowance over here, so that if we turn this right sides out, there's less tension on the seam. You wanna cut little triangles along the curved edge, but be very careful not to cut through these stitches. For the back neckline, I only sewed up until this point, and then we have 5 centimeters of open space in the back neckline, and you wanna cut some triangles over here in this curve. Leave this part untouched, so only in the seam allowance over here we're going to make some snips. So when it's done, it should look something like this for the front, like this for the back. So I've made some snips here, not here. So next up, we're going to unfold these 2 pieces, and you're going to press this seam, and you're gonna press the seam allowance towards the lining. So we wanna press the seam allowance together with the lining. Same for the front bodice, press the seam allowance towards the lining. My neckline was looking a little bit wonky. You can still see it on this side. So I went back and cut some more snips into the seam allowance. So I'm gonna do the same over here, cut some extra little snips into the seam allowance, which will help smooth out the neckline seam. You can also clip your seam allowance a little bit shorter if you want to like 1/2 of a centimeter or 2/8 of an inch. And now, so this is the neckline of the front bodice, and now we're going to understitch the neckline. Sew a straight stitch on top of the lining next to the seam. So on top of the lining, attaching the lining to the seam allowance. So you wanna try and sew as close as possible to our original seam on top of the lining. I'm going to use some white thread for this, so it will be less visible. So I did end up shortening the seam allowance a little bit. And for the understitching for the back side of the bodice, again, you want to only understitch the part next to the seam that we made, and this part remains open. So I have my understitching finished. As you can see, it's right next to the previous neckline seam, and I have attached the seam allowance to the lining. And now you're just going to press this seam, both for the front bodice and for the 2 back bodice pieces. The next step is to attach the shoulder edges of the back bodice to that of the front bodice. So this is my front bodice, and I'm going to unfold this like this. And this might look a little bit confusing at first. So I have my front bodice, which looks like this, with the right sides of both the main fabric and the lining pointing upwards. And now I'm going to align these 2 shoulder edges with the back pieces. So I have one of my back pieces over here. I'm also going to unfold this, and you want to lay this right sides facing down. So this is 1/2 of the bodice. You're going to put this on top and align these shoulder seams, and you want to make sure that this neckline seam is aligned. So we're gonna pin starting from that neckline seam all the way along the shoulder. I'm going to show it again for the other side a little bit closer. So this is the right side as worn of the front bodice, and then this is the right side of the back bodice. And basically you want to align this shoulder seam. So I'm going to unfold this back bodice piece and I'm going to align it right sides facing down, so towards the front bodice piece. Okay, let's have a look. So I sewed along this shoulder seam, and if you fold it open, it should look something like this. So the lining lines up neatly. To finish this shoulder seam off, you're going to press the seam allowance open. So you're going to unfold the seam allowance and press it open on both sides. Okay, so I have my bodice pieces connected. I'm going to open this up. So I have the front bodice piece and the two back bodice pieces. They are now connected along the neckline, the lining, and then the shoulder seams are also connected. Next up, we are going to close the armhole seams and the side seams. To finish the armhole seams, I'm going to use the burrito method. So we're gonna squish all of the fabric to be able to connect this armhole seam to this lining armhole seam. And you don't want to sew it like this, of course. We want the raw edge to be hidden inside of the garment. So how we're gonna do it is like this. I'm going to start with this armhole, which is the left armhole as worn. So if you're wearing the piece, this would be the left armhole. And I'm gonna take this fabric. So I have my lining and my main fabric, and I want the wrong side of this to lay down, so to be facing down towards the table. So I'm gonna fold this out of the way, and we're gonna open up all of this so that the wrong side of the left side of my bodice piece is facing down for both the main fabric and the lining. And now we want to connect. So this is the armhole of the main piece and the lining, and we want to connect this so that we can close it. Normally, if you use the burrito method, this is why it's called the burrito method, you would have this fabric like sort of laying in between, and you would have to sandwich the fabric, so roll it up between these two layers to be able to close it. But because my back bodice consists of two pieces that are not connected yet, we can actually just fold this out of the way, and we're going to pin this edge to this. You want to make sure that the shoulder seams are lined up. So I'm going to start pinning over here, lining up those shoulder seams, and then you're just going to pin all along the armhole seam, starting from here, going down to here. I'm going to snip inside the seam allowance. Be careful not to cut through the stitches, especially on the cornered edges. You want to make some snips in the seam allowance to make the seam line a bit more smooth once we turn it inside out. I've made some snips in the seam allowance, and I'm also going to trim this seam allowance to 1.5 centimeters or 2/8 of an inch. Next up, we're going to try and understitch this armhole seam. Before we do that, I'm going to press the seam allowance towards the lining. So just like we did with the neckline seam allowance, we're gonna press all of this seam allowance towards the lining. You wanna do it in a few steps. So first start from the front of the bodice piece, and then you can press on the other side, also pressing the seam allowance towards the lining. Once you have that seam allowance pressed towards the lining, you're going to turn this part right sides out, like this. So I have the front over here, the back over here, and we have closed one armhole seam, and we want to understitch this seam. So what you're going to do is sew right next to the seam we just made, the armhole seam, on the lining. So try and get as close as possible to this seam, but so on top of the lining, and you want to attach the lining to the seam allowance that we pressed towards the lining. And of course we do have this shoulder seam that is now closed, so you will want to do this in 2 steps. You're going to start first on one side of the bodice. So this is over here, my side seam. You start over here and you sew all the way up until somewhere over here. At some point this will become a bit difficult. You might be able to get to the shoulder seam, but of course there is like a lot of fabric here in the back because we closed the shoulder. So you want to try and get as close as possible to this shoulder seam without catching any of the other fabric. So you do this for one side and then you repeat starting from the other side, understitching the lining to the seam allowance. So I finished the understitching for the armhole, and as you can see, this is the back part of the bodice. I was able to sew up until the shoulder seam, and then I repeated the understitching for the front bodice. Here I was not able to get all the way up to the shoulder seam, so I ended my understitch over here, and as you can see, this gives you a very nice effect of the main fabric being pulled towards the lining a little bit, so on the outside of the garment you will not be able to see the lining. So next up we want to press this armhole seam, and then we will move on to the next armhole. Next up we are going to close the other armhole, so the right armhole, and you're going to just repeat all of the steps we just did to close the left armhole, but on the other side. So now our lining is almost completely attached to the main fabric of the bodice except for the back. So this is where we will install the zipper later on, but I will leave it open for now. All that I want to do now is close these side seams. Okay, very quick note here. If you did not attach the side straps yet, you want to do that now, and then we will continue with the side seams. So we're going to take this corner. So this is the corner between the armhole and the side seam, and align it right sides together with this corner, this armhole seam, like this. And you want to make sure that these seams are neatly aligned. And then you're going to pin the lining together, right sides. So this is my front bodice lining and my back bodice lining. You're going to pin this together all the way down. You want to make sure that this fold that we pressed earlier, so the bottom of the bodice pieces, that it remains folded upwards. I'm going to pin this while this is still folded, like so. And then you pin the other side, so the main fabric. So you're pinning the front bodice right sides together with the back bodice, like so. And the side strap should be sandwiched in between these two pieces. We have pinned the entire side seam. You also want to make sure that the side strap remains flat between these two layers. We did already attach it to the front bodice, so that should not be an issue normally. And then you're going to sew this together along the complete side seam using a seam allowance of 1 centimeter or 5/8 of an inch. I have finished sewing this side seam all along the edge, and next I'm going to press open this seam. So you're gonna fold open the seam allowance like this and press it all the way down. And then when you're pressing it open over here, so this is the main fabric, you press open the seam. The raw edge of the strap will be attached to the front of the bodice, so you want it to lay like this. The raw edge of the strap is pointing towards the front of the bodice, and this will cause the side strap itself to be laying towards the back of the bodice. And I have pressed my side seam open. I'm going to fold this wrong sides together so that you get the armhole like this, the way you would wear it. And then I'm also going to press this armhole seam. Okay, so we have one more step to finish the side seam. I'm going to open it up like this. So this is my side seam on the right side of the bodice as worn. And because we attached the main fabric to the main fabric and the lining to the lining, these two layers are not attached to each other along the side seam. So this is completely loose. And we want to reinforce this along the seam allowance to attach the main fabric to the lining by stitching part of the seam allowance together. So first of all, you want to make sure that your lining and your main fabric are laying nice and flat the way you want them to lay eventually. And then I'm going to take some pins and along this back side pin my main fabric to my lining just to make sure it doesn't shift around like this. So you can add some pins just to make sure these two layers are not moving or sliding across each other. You want this to lay flat. And then I'm going to open up this top layer, and you want to now attach the seam allowance of the main fabric to the seam allowance over here of the lining. And we're going to do this along, so this is the front side of the bodice. I'm going to do this along the side seam that's pointing towards the front of the bodice, attaching this side seam seam allowance to the seam allowance over here of my front bodice, which is also the seam allowance where the side strap is attached. And I'm going to pin this in place so that it doesn't move, like so. So I have attached half of my seam allowance, the part that's pointing towards the front of the bodice, to the seam allowance of my lining. And you're just going to sew a straight stitch starting at the bottom edge. Oops, actually I made a little mistake here. So you don't want to start sewing from the bottom edge of the bodice. You actually want to measure about 2 centimeters or 6/8 of an inch upwards from the bottom folded edge of the lining and start sewing there, and then you can continue sewing in the seam allowance. And you want to do this because we want to leave the bottom part of the lining open so we can close it up later when we finish the skirt. I will correct this later in the video, but just so you know, I'm attaching it here along the full seam allowance, which is not what you are supposed to do. And then I'm going to sew in the seam allowance, attaching these together about halfway in the middle of the seam allowance. I'm going to sew a straight stitch. That was actually perfect because my bobbin ran out just after I backstitched at the end of the seam, and I did end up stitching up to the armhole about 1.5 centimeters away from the top. So my seam allowance is now attached I can fold this right side out again. And now your fabric of your lining and the main fabric are attached to each other along the side seam, and this is not going to move around as much. So you're going to repeat all of the steps we just did for the side seam on this side. I am now at my overlock machine and I'm going to overlock both of these pocket pieces. Okay, so I'm going to now press the edges of these pocket pieces. This is the top side of the pocket, I have decided. So this is where the pocket opening will be, and these three edges will be attached to the skirt. And I'm going to fold over the edges by 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch and then press. And I'm going to do this for this side, and this side. The top edge I'm going to fold over by 2 centimeters or 6/8 of an inch. Okay, so I have these 3 sides of the edges pressed and just the top side left. So this will be 2 centimeters or 6/8 of an inch. Like that, and then I'll just repeat it for the second pocket. Okay, so I have both of my pocket pieces pressed, and now I'm going to attach this top edge, the folded top edge of the pocket, by sewing a straight stitch across. I'm going to sew right above this overlocked edge to attach this fold. I'm placing my pocket pieces onto the right side of the skirt front piece. You can find measurements on how to position these pockets in the pattern. So there's one page where you can find measurements to cut the skirt for the different sizes and how to place the pockets. So you can measure that out directly onto the skirt piece. If you did print the pattern pieces for the skirt, they also have markings, so you can trace those and place the pocket piece down. I'm going to change up the placement a little bit. It should be something like this based on the measurements, but I want to pattern match the pocket with the skirt. So I'm going to place it like this. Okay, so that's pinned in place, and then you're going to sew a straight stitch starting at one opening, going down, across and up again, ending here, and then this will be the opening of the pocket. And then you will reinforce the opening. What you could do is some back stitching across this opening to make this extra secure, or what I like to do is sew a very narrow short zigzag stitch on top of this straight stitch that we will sew to make this opening extra sturdy. You do that for one pocket and repeat it for the next one. And you do want to sew as close as possible to the edge. Okay, so I've attached both of the pocket pieces to the skirt, and then to reinforce the seam along the pocket opening, I did sew a very narrow and short zigzag stitch on all of the pocket openings, just for about 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch. So before we put the skirt together, I'm going to overlock all of the side seams. So this is my front piece. I'm going to overlock along this edge and also the edge on the other side. And I'm gonna do the same for my back skirt pieces. So I'm going to overlock along this edge and this edge as well. So this is the side seam that we're gonna connect to the front of the skirt, and this will be the center back. If you don't have an overlocker, you could also use a zigzag stitch, or to finish off these side seams, because we are going to put the two overlocked edges together and stitch them together. You could also use a French seam, which will hide the raw edge. So in that case, you don't need to overlock. I do recommend testing this out first with a scrap piece of fabric, because we are going to be gathering along the top edge of the skirt when it is connected to the back. So you're gathering across this seam, and if you're using a French seam, that will give you a little bit of bulk I think it should still be possible, but you may want to test it out for your specific fabric. I have overlocked this skirt edge for the front piece and for both of my back pieces. So this is one of them. And now I'm going to connect the front to the back of the skirt. So the right sides of the fabric are facing each other. And then I'm going to pin along this edge like so and so together with a straight stitch using a seam allowance of 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch. And you're going to do this for this side and repeat it on the other side of the skirt as well. Once you've finished sewing together the back pieces of the skirt with the front, you're just going to press open this seam so it lays nice and flat. So for the next step, we will be gathering the skirt and attaching it to the bottom of the bodice, to the main fabric only. I'm going to sew 2 basting stitches across the top of the skirt, across the full length of my skirt. And so you're gonna start at one edge of the back skirt piece, so all the way down over here until you reach the other back side. So 2 parallel basting stitches, so that's a straight stitch at the largest stitch length. Don't backstitch, just sew 2 straight lines. So 1 basting stitch at 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch, and a second basting stitch parallel to that one at 2 centimeters or 6/8 of an inch. On my machine, I'm going to turn up my stitch length to the largest stitch length. Okay, so I have sewn my 2 basting stitches across the top of the skirt. I'm also going to place a little pin marking the center front of the skirt. And then I'm going to start gathering the skirt by pulling on the tails over here. And you wanna keep gathering until the width of the skirt matches the width of the bottom edge of the bodice. So you have your bobbin threads on the bottom and the other threads at the top. And then you just kind of want to start pulling. So I'm gonna grab these 2 bobbin threads and start pulling, and that will create the gathers. And you can then distribute these gathers further on across the full width of the skirt. And you're going to do this starting on this side up until the middle of the skirt. And then I find it easiest to gather the other half starting from the other edge of the skirt, pulling on the 2 bobbin tails. I have finished gathering the skirt, and now I'm going to make sure that these gathers are distributed evenly. This is where the side seam is of my skirt. This is the side seam of the bodice. So this will be lined up. And then you want to make sure that this length of the back bodice matches this gathered length of the skirt. And between these 2 points, you kind of want to make sure that these gathers are distributed somewhat evenly. I realized I made a little mistake earlier when attaching the lining to the main fabric in the seam allowance. I have attached the seam allowances together all the way down until I reached the bottom edge of the lining, which is still folded over, by the way. And the issue here is next we are going to attach the skirt first to the main fabric only, and then we want to be able to fold this inwards and close the lining like so. So you want to leave a little gap over here. So this is still detached about 2 centimeters from the bottom edge upwards, so 2 centimeters or 1 inch upwards. So I'm going to unpick. Okay, there we go. So I've unpicked part of the stitching in the seam allowance for about 2 centimeters. So now you can see my lining is not attached anymore to the main fabric at the bottom. Along the rest of the seam allowance, it's still attached, so this is not going to move. And then we can later on at the skirt fold this part under and close up the lining. Okay, so now that the skirt is gathered and the gathers are distributed evenly, we want to sew the right side of the skirt together with the right side of the bodice, and we're going to attach the skirt to the main fabric of the bodice only. So you also have the lining underneath. You kind of want to fold it out of the way. So we're only going to attach the skirt to the main fabric of the bodice, and we will close the lining later. So I'm going to lay this on top of my skirt, and now I'm going to line up the center fronts. So I have the center front of my bodice here, and I'm gonna pin this together with the center front of my skirt. I'm gonna do the same for the side seams. So I have my side seam over here. I'm gonna pin this together with the side seam of the skirt. So you're pinning everything right sides together, and I will do the same for the other side seam. And then at this point you can still distribute the gathers a little bit to make sure the lengths match up and everything is nice and flat. And you also want to line up center back edge of the bodice with the center back edge of the skirt. So you're going to pin this together across the full width of the skirt, and then we're going to sew a straight stitch across at a seam allowance of 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch, which should be right in the middle of these two basting stitches. I've tied a little knot in the two long tails once I made sure that these lengths were matching up to make sure these gathers don't come undone. Before you start sewing, make sure to set your stitch length back to a shorter length. I always forget this. So as you're reaching the side seams, you want to be extra careful that you're not stitching on the lining, so fold it out of the way. Make sure you're only stitching through the skirt and the main piece of the bodice. So that is my skirt seam done, and as you can see, it is attached only to the main fabric. We will close this up later. You will be able to see one of the basting stitches, still the other one is hidden in the seam allowance. So you're going to want to unpick this white thread and remove it because we no longer need it. We are going to press the seam allowance and you're going to press it upwards towards the bodice. You don't have to overlock this because later on we will be hiding the seam allowance in the lining. Next up, we are going to insert the invisible zipper and close up the center back seam. So I'm gonna take my dress like this, and I want to measure out a marking point up until where the zipper will be visible from the outside. So I'm gonna take my zipper and I'm gonna align it along this center back edge, starting at the top of the center back. You want to leave 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch between the upper zipper teeth and the top edge of the bodice, the center back of the bodice. What I like to do is close this and fold this inwards between the folded edge and the top of the bodice. Needs to be 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch. Align this with the rest of this center edge. And I'm going to look where the end of the zipper is. And I'm gonna measure about 10 centimeters up from that point, so 10 centimeters or 4 inches, and I'm gonna make a mark on the fabric. So we're going to insert the zipper across this length, and then the bottom part of the zipper will be inside of the dress. So next up, I want to close this part of the seam, so the bottom part of my seam. This is where we will install the zipper. This part will be closed, so I'm going to align the center back edge of the dress right sides with the other center back edge. So again, we're not finishing the lining yet. We will do this later. So you only want to close the part without the lining, and you want to line up this center back seam. We're only going to sew this part, but I'm going to make sure that this seam between the bodice and the skirt is nicely aligned on both sides, so that's even. And I'm going to pin this together. So I'm gonna pin across the full center back, and then I'm going to sew a straight stitch starting at the mark that we made, going down to the bottom hem of the skirt at a seam allowance of 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch. You want to make sure to backstitch a few times at this mark to make this extra secure. Okay, so I have sewn this seam closed. You can now remove these other pins because we will be installing the zipper next. And then you want to press open this seam. Before installing the invisible zipper, I'm going to prep this zipper a little bit. So if you've sewn an invisible zipper before, you know that you want to be sewing in the zipper tape as close as possible to the zipper teeth, so that only the zipper teeth are visible from the outside. If you just get your invisible zipper, you will see that these zipper teeth are folded inwards a little bit, but you want to be sewing over here in the crease. It can make it a bit easier if you first go in with your iron and kind of press this open a little bit. You do want to be careful here to not melt the zipper. Okay, so next up we will be installing 1/2 of the zipper and then the next. I have my dress turned with the wrong side out. I find it easiest this way, but you could also do it the other way around. So this is the center back, and we have this seam closed. And basically, we want our zipper to be inserted like this. So it will end over here, and then we will attach it to both sides of the center back. So I'm gonna open this up, the zipper, and I'm going to start with the left side of the zipper. So this is the right side of the zipper. This is the wrong side. And I'm going to align this left side with the left side of the bodice. So this is the left side as you would wear it. And I'm going to pin this part of the zipper, so the left part, with the right sides facing the right side of the bodice. So I'm starting over here at the top, and you want to align the zipper tape with the edge, the center back edge. And again, we are going to leave 1 centimeter of seam allowance between these uppermost teeth, so you can fold the zipper tape out of the way to see where the zipper would end. This needs to be 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch of seam allowance, and then you're going to pin this part of the zipper right sides together with the center back edge of the bodice. And once you have this pinned, you can unfold the top of the zipper, and so you're gonna pin this down all the way. Also, once you reach the skirt, you're just gonna keep going. And this is why I like to have my dress turned wrong sides out. So once you reach this part where we have closed the center back seam, you are going to keep pinning in the seam allowance of the skirt. We are going to sew the zipper to the center back and also to a little part of this seam allowance over here, and we will be stitching right next to this center back seam in the seam allowance, attaching the zipper. You want to make sure that the seam allowance remains folded upwards towards the bodice. So I will now be sewing the zipper tape to the dress. Start at the uppermost zipper teeth, 1 centimeter removed from the top of the bodice, and then you're gonna sew as close as possible, so in this crease basically, so you're not sewing on the zipper teeth but right in the zipper tape next to the zipper teeth. You can either use a normal zipper foot like this one, or I also have this specific presser foot that is meant to sew invisible zippers. So the way this works is your zipper teeth will be going in one channel, and then you will be sewing right next to that. While you're sewing, the zipper teeth will be guided by the channel, which allows you to get a bit closer to the zipper teeth. It will look something like this. So the zipper teeth are running through the left channel of the invisible zipper foot, And then as you are sewing, you want to try and go slow, and you kind of want to fold the zipper teeth out of the way. Try and get as close as possible to these zipper teeth. So once you reach the part where the center back seam is closed, which is over here, you're going to keep sewing for about 2 more centimeters, 6/8 of an inch up until here. And you want to make sure that you are sewing only in the seam allowance of the skirt, attaching the zipper tape to that seam allowance, and you are sewing on the right side of this seam. Okay, and then you will be able to see it is right next to the zipper teeth, and then on the outside you are still able to see a little bit of the zipper tape, but mostly only the teeth. Also, this is why it's a good idea to use a matching color of zipper, because even if the tape is showing a little bit, it won't be super visible. So you can see over here, this is where I sewed in the seam allowance. So this is where my zipper is attached. And then this is where the center back seam starts, where the skirt is closed. And I sewed in the seam allowance for a little bit. And you have about 1 or 2 millimeters of gap between these 2 points. So I try to get as close as possible to this seam. And now I'm going to attach the remaining side of the zipper to the other side of the dress. So this is the right side of the zipper, and this is the right side of my dress if I would be wearing it. And you want to pin the right side of the zipper to the right side of the dress, the way we did on the other side as well. And this time I'm going to first close the zipper, and I'm gonna pin the zipper tape over here where the seam is, and you want to make sure this is lined up nicely. Because we already closed this center back seam earlier and we made sure everything was aligned, this should already align neatly, but just to make sure, I'm going to pin this part first, and I'm going to open up the zipper again, and I will keep pinning the zipper tape to the right side of the fabric. So once you've pinned the other side in place, you can check if everything is nicely aligned by zipping the zipper closed and then having a look on the right side of the garment. And most importantly, you want to make sure that this seam is lining up nicely. So this time I'm going to sew from the bottom of the zipper towards the top edge of the bodice, attaching the zipper to the dress. This part will be a little bit more fiddly than the other side, because earlier we had the zipper unzipped up until over here, but this time you want your little zipper to be on the outside of the garment. Of course, we do also want to sew in the seam allowance over here. This part will be a bit more difficult to sew with an invisible zipper foot, so I'm actually going to start over here sewing where the zipper is opened up, and using my invisible zipper foot to close up this seam. And then I'm gonna go back in and then sew a stitch over here in the seam allowance and line it up with the seam that I'm going to sew with my invisible zipper foot. Okay, so I've attached most of the zipper with my invisible zipper foot. I just need to attach this final part, this bottom part of the zipper, and attach it for a few centimeters in the seam allowance. So to do this, I'm going to zip this up a little bit more. So here you can see this is my center back seam. This is where I have attached the zipper, and I'm going to sew this part, trying to line up with where I started my previous seam. And for this, I'm going to use a regular zipper foot, because the close-up zipper won't fit under an invisible zipper foot. And so I want to start at the same point where I ended the stitch on the other side. So I can kind of see where the thread is poking out, but I'm also going to mark it. So I'm going to start over here so it matches up with the other side. Okay, so I finished this seam. It doesn't look super neat on the inside, so you can see with the invisible zipper foot, I was able to get a little bit closer than with the normal zipper foot, but I was able to kind of reach this previous seam and overlap it. You can see this is nicely aligned, the pattern is matching, and then let's see. Okay, so you can kind of see here, this is where the center back seam starts, and you can kind of see if I pull the zipper. So here it is really nearly invisible, and then it's a little bit more visible over here. So I think what I'm going to do is just press this a little bit inwards so you won't see as much. But I'm very happy with how this turned out. So you can not really see even the zipper teeth when it's closed. So we have a very neat invisible zipper. We are now going to finish closing up the lining. If you look on the inside of the garment, the lining is attached everywhere except for in the center back. So we still need to finish the neckline. We need to finish this center back edge, and we need to finish the waistline. So I'm going to start with this part of the neckline, and we basically just want to continue this seam that we made earlier along the neckline, closing up this seam and connecting the right side of the lining to the right side of the main fabric. So to finish this part, you want your zipper to be opened up, and we are going to fold the seam allowance of the zipper open. So you want this to be laying flat, so the zipper tape will be over here showing, and then here you have the zipper teeth. And now we want to align the right side of the lining with the right side of the main fabric. And this might require you to twist the garment around a little bit because the lining is attached in other places. So you kind of want to try and twist it around a little bit until you get these two layers to lay flat against each other. And this is our previous seam. This ended over here. And you basically just want to continue this neckline seam going from here up until here. And you're going to sew over the zipper and the zipper tape, which will be sandwiched in between the main fabric and the lining. And you're going to continue this seam, which had a seam allowance of 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch, like so. And so you're going to do this for both sides of the garment. Okay, so I have closed up this seam and I've sewn across the zipper tape. So now if you twist it around, right sides out, you will see we have now closed the neckline, like so. Just like we did for the rest of the neckline seam, I'm going to trim this seam allowance in half, and I'm also gonna cut this corner, cutting this part of the zipper tape off to kind of reduce some bulk. This part is a little bit curved, so you may also want to add some snips over here, being careful not to cut through these stitches. So to finish up this neckline, I'm going to press the seam allowance towards the lining, and then holding the seam allowance together with the lining, I'm going to finish this understitching that we sewed earlier. So this is a straight stitch as close as possible to this other seam. I'm going to continue sewing up until about here. So this part you don't need to understitch because it will be folded inwards later. Okay, so we have the neckline finished and understitched, like so, also on the other side. So now we are going to close this center back seam. And again here you want to fold right sides together. Your lining is attached in a bunch of places. You're going to want to twist the garment around a little bit, and your zipper seam allowance is still folded open like this. So you have your zipper tape here, your zipper teeth over here, and you're going to twist this around a little bit so that you can align this lining center back edge right sides with the center back edge of the main fabric, and you're going to sandwich the zipper and the zipper tape in between, and you're going to pin this. It's easiest to start here at the top, pinning this in place, and then you're going to notice like a lot of this fabric will be kind of squished in between, so you will have to twist things around a little bit, and we're just going to pin this down along the remainder of the bodice. So I have it pinned down. You can see I had to twist around the lining a little bit, so I have my zipper sandwiched in between, and once you reach the bottom of the lining, you want to make sure that this bottom edge of the lining remains folded upwards so we can finish it neatly afterwards. This folded edge should be lining up somewhat with this waistline seam. And so now you're going to sew a straight stitch across this center back seam. For this, I would use a seam allowance of maybe 0.5 centimeters or 2/8 of an inch. And you may also want to use a zipper foot because these zipper teeth will get in the way otherwise. So you're gonna sew a straight stitch starting here, going all the way down till you've reached the bottom of the lining. Okay, so I have closed this seam all the way down to the bottom edge of the lining, and then you can flip it right sides out like so, and the zipper teeth should be poking out, and the zipper tape is sandwiched between the lining and the main fabric. And you can see on the inside of the garment, we have a bit more space between the zipper teeth and the lining. I'm just going to press this, and you may want to press the lining a little bit towards the zipper teeth to hide this, but this is all on the inside of the garment. And so I'm going to repeat this for the other center back seam, and then I'm going to press everything. So now you can see my lining is nice and closed everywhere except for this bottom part, which we will close in a moment. And I'm going to press these edges to finish this off. Again, be careful not to melt your zipper teeth. To finish off the lining, we're going to close the bottom edge, and I'm going to do this by hand stitching. So you want to grab a needle and thread and attach this bottom edge of your lining to the seam allowance of the skirt, and you want to try and do it so that your hand stitching is not going through to the other side. So try and sew in the lining and then catch a little bit of the seam allowance over here, right above this waistline seam. And you're gonna do this all the way around until you reach this side, and then your lining will be fully closed. You also want to pay attention over here. So you may want to pin this down first all across because it needs to line up. Over here, you want the side seam to line up, and also on the other side, you want this side seam to line up. And normally your lining should be folded so that it just goes over the seam allowance of the skirt. So all of this will be hidden between the main fabric and the lining of the dress. So I did decide to pin this down first, and I'm slowly hand stitching like so. So here I'm gonna catch a little bit of the seam allowance and catch a little bit of the folded edge, and you just repeat this all the way around. Then we have one step left, and then we are finished with the Marlon dress. So I'm going to hem the skirt. I'm going to do this by folding over the bottom edge and pressing. I'm going to fold over by 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch and then press. And I'm actually also going to press it a second time, so I'm going to fold it over a second time so that the raw edge is hidden. Press it again, and then I'm going to sew a straight stitch all across, and I will be using the matching thread for this because this will be visible from the outside. Okay, so that is the dress completely finished. All you want to do now is give the skirt hem a final press, and any other parts of the garment that you want to press, or that might be a bit wrinkly, you can give those a final press, and then your Marlon dress is ready to wear. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed sewing the Marlon dress. If you want to share your results on social media, feel free to tag me. I am at Studio Minapop on all platforms. If you like this sewing pattern, you might also like my other patterns. You can find them on my website or on Etsy, depending on where you are in the world. Happy sewing, and I will see you next time.